Thank you, Chad, and good evening, everyone. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you here to Aquinas and this very special event as we celebrate the anniversary of the Aquinas College Contemporary Writers Series. Let's give them a hand. For the past 15 years, the CWS has brought to West Michigan some of the best writers in the world who have delivered free public readings and have generously shared their time and talent with our students here and with the community. The Contemporary Writers Series was the inspiration of Aquinas alumna Linda Nemec Foster and her husband, Dr. Tony Foster. They brought this idea of a writer's series to former President Paul Nelson. When Linda was a student here, she wished that there had been such a series, and around 1995, she realized that there really could be a series, except that she and Tony would have to step up and use their creativity and some of their finances to get it going. With a great deal of effort and energy, the Contemporary Writers Series Committee, comprised of Aquinas faculty, staff, students, as well as Linda and a number of other community members, they traveled to writers' festivals. They combed literary anthologies, and well, you know, they have brought many of them here to our community to present in West Michigan. The series has been a great success through the years, and it was certainly supported by Harry Knopke, another former president, who is also tonight one of the evening sponsors, and I know that Harry and Sheila are here. Let's give them a hand. The dinner tonight is also a signature event of Aquinas College's 125th anniversary that you know we're celebrating. All through this year, the college has been recognizing its core values, and you see them here behind me: prayer, study, service, and community. We've been celebrating with occasions that remember our past and also call attention to looking to our future. This month, we're celebrating the core value of study. And we've had presentations that shine a spotlight on the importance of the life of the mind as it's expressed itself through the Catholic intellectual tradition. Through these events and our tradition of outstanding academic programs, Aquinas affirms the value of study as a way of engaging the world through our vocations and our service to the community and to the world. This evening would not be possible without the support of many people so that we can continue to celebrate study. And I'd like to mention and single out our honorary co-chairs, Hank and Lisa Meyer. Thank you, Hank and Lisa. Lisa. Thank you for co-chairing this event, but also for your ongoing support of the Contemporary Writers Series. The proceeds of this evening's event will help to grow the endowment for the CWS, and we need that. We need that to keep it going, and so it takes people like Hank and Lisa and many other contributors to keep this endowment growing so that we can keep bringing these great writers to our community. Also deserving thanks are the members of the Contemporary Writers Series Committee, who work tirelessly year after year, bringing talent like Scott Turow to our campus and to our community. And so I would like to ask the members of the CWS committee to please stand and be recognized. You worked very hard. Please stand. I also want to thank our 125th anniversary underwriters, and they have given generously this year to the many events and commemorations that we've had to celebrate the history of Aquinas and all the contributions that it's made to West Michigan. And the names are in your program. Please look at them. We feel very privileged to have them supporting these events. And finally, of course, the thanks for this evening's, the other sponsors. And those individuals and organizations are also very cleverly listed in your program by the titles of Scott's books. And so you can see them. Please look at them. We appreciate our donors for this evening. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the woman who brought this series to us, an alumna for whom we are very proud, whose vision and constant care has made this series an ongoing and permanent reality. Linda Nemec Foster graduated from Aquinas College and received her MFA in creative writing from the Goddard College in Vermont. She is the author of 9 collections of poetry, including Listen to the Landscape and Talking Diamonds. Her work has also been published in numerous journals, magazines, and anthologies, translated in Europe, and produced for the stage. Linda has received awards and honors from the Arts Foundation of Michigan, ArtServe Michigan, the Nation's Writers' Voice Project, and the Academy of American Poets. She was selected to serve as Grand Rapids' first Poet Laureate from 2003 to 2005. In 1997, she and her husband Tony founded the Contemporary Writers Series at Aquinas, and she is still, and so is Tony, very involved and an important member of the series programming committee. May I introduce to you Linda Nemec Foster.
Oh, what a night. Thank you, Juan, and a special and personal thank you from me to our honorary co-chairs, Hank and Liesl Meyer, to all our event sponsors, to Pam Lupke and my dear CWS Programming Committee, and to all of you for coming here tonight and helping us celebrate a great evening, the Contemporary Writers Series 15th anniversary. Every academic year, we host 4 writers on campus, 2 in the fall semester, 2 in the spring. And this event is the highlight and culmination of our special year. And a number of you have asked me how to get on the mailing list. If you look on your program, there's a wonderful paragraph that describes the Contemporary Writers Series, and there's information on how to be on our mailing list. When my husband Tony and I first approached Aquinas in 1995 with the idea for this series, and when that idea finally became a reality in the fall of '97 with our first author, we could not have imagined the significant impact that the program would have not only on this campus and its students, but on the greater West Michigan community. For example, over the course of the last 15 years, our events have been attended by approximately 14,000 people. That first author, by the way, was award-winning poet Marilyn Nelson. Since her visit, we have welcomed nearly 60 authors to Aquinas: novelists, poets, short story writers, memoirists, playwrights, and creative nonfiction writers. Nationally and internationally, they represent the brightest stars in our literary firmament. Winners of the Pulitzer Prize, the Booker Prize, which is Britain's highest literary award, the Ruth Lilly Prize, the American Book Award, the Pushcart Prize, NEA and Guggenheim Fellowships, and the biggest enchilada, the biggest honor of them all, the Nobel Prize in Literature. That Nobel laureate, Seamus Heaney, visited us from Ireland in May of 2006. After his reading, he said to me, And I'm not going to do his brogue. I'm not going to do the Irish accent. But after his reading, he said to me, "Do you know what you have here at Aquinas? One of the very best reading series in America." We couldn't agree more. Thank you. The best, the brightest, which leads us to tonight's guest of honor, writer and attorney Scott Turow. I know his accomplishments as a lawyer are impressive, but no offense to the other lawyers in the audience, and I know there are a few out there. I want to concentrate on Mr. Turow's remarkable achievements as one of this country's most gifted writers. He has written 9 best-selling works of fiction, including Presumed Innocent, Burden of Proof, Personal Injuries, which Time magazine named as the best work of fiction of 1999, Reversible Errors, which won the Heartland Prize and Chicago Tribune's Fiction Prize, The Laws of Our Fathers, and Innocent, the long-awaited sequel to Presumed Innocent. He has also written 2 nonfiction books, 1L, about his experience as a first-year law student at Harvard, and Ultimate Punishment, a reflection on the death penalty, and winner of the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. In addition to these credits, 3 of his books have been adapted for film and television. There won't be a quiz after that, after I read. And I won't even begin to talk about his work in the rock band, the Rock Bottom Remainders. All of this prolific output is impressive enough, but it is the quality of his writing that is truly outstanding. He creates indelible characters that readers deeply care about and complex plots that transcend their genre, to quote George F. Will writing in Newsweek. His work has been compared to Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, John Cheever, and Theodore Dreiser. And in this light, critics have praised him as profoundly gifted, masterful, timeless, distinctive, brilliant, eloquent. As one reviewer wrote, "Many other lawyers have written novels since he led the way with Presumed Innocent in 1987, but they can't carry his briefcase." Turow outclasses them all. Please join me in welcoming Scott Turow.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not sure how the Rock Bottom Remainders crawled into my biography, but I have to say that whatever I do with the Rock Bottom Remainders, it can't be called work, and candor also compels me to admit that it can't be called music either. I thought I would give you sort of a little biographical tour and some readings of the works that I was writing as I have gone through what is turning into a longer life. And just to sort of back up, my ambition from the time I was about 11 years old was to be a novelist. I had a mom whose dream was to be a novelist, and I loved my mother, and I took on her ambition rather than the ambition that my parents had for me, which was to be a doctor like my dad. And so I went off to Amherst College. I know we have a table of Amherst alums here tonight. I've gotten a chance to visit with several of you. But I arrived at Amherst in 1966, wanting to be a novelist. And at that time, Amherst was not only an all-male school, it was also a place where there was no such thing as creative writing classes. And creative writing was regarded as the intellectual equivalent of basket weaving. I guess some of the people in the English department didn't believe you could teach teach anybody to write, and I have to say I differ with that enormously, and actually have found during a couple of stints in my life when I've been a teacher of creative writing that you actually can teach students a lot about literature by making them attempt to write it. But at any rate, no creative writing, and so I took the refuge of English majors always, and started taking English classes. Now, at that time in 1966, when I entered at Amherst, the Amherst English department was ruled, and I use that word advisedly, by a man named Theodore Baird. And Baird is best remembered to literary posterity as Robert Frost's best friend. And people, I'm sure Linda, for example, knows quite a bit about Frost, and for them it's often a surprise to hear about Baird, since they thought that Frost had no friends at all. But Baird was equally curmudgeonly, confrontational kind of guy. He once met Frank Lloyd Wright at a cocktail party and told him, you can design houses for rich people, but you can't design a house for a man like me, an ordinary man. And plans for a house showed up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, where he lived about a month and a half later. Anyway, Baird was an expositor of something called the New Criticism. And what the New Criticism provided was that the only interpretive tool you need to understand a work of literature are the words on the page. History does not matter. The A-bomb may have gone off outside the poet's window. You don't need to know that to understand the poem. Nor does biography. The author may have been a cross-dresser raised in a cage. That didn't matter. All that mattered was the words on the page. And to sort of cement the point, Baird would walk into his freshman English class, and he would hold up a yellow pencil, and he would look at the first young man, and he would say, "What is it?" And the first young man, not surprisingly, would respond, "It's a pencil, Professor," at which point Baird would walk up and hit him across the head with it. And he would then look at the second young man, who would quail a bit and say, "What is it?" And the second young man would describe it as a slender yellow object, and he would get hit. And Baird would do this until he had hit all 15 of his students in freshman English, and he would then come back to the front of the classroom and say, "It's a weapon." And he'd then walk over to the window and point to it and say to the first young man, generally hiding by now under his student desk, "What is it?" And the young man from the floor would answer, it's a window, Professor. And Baird would say, "No, it's an exit." And he would open the window, step over the sash, and be gone for the remainder of the first class period. Now, what Baird was trying to teach, that a single word can change our perception of our context as human beings, is a lesson that stayed with me throughout my life as both a writer and as a lawyer. Baird, ironically, taught the father of the law and literature movement, James Boyd White, and the first book in the law and literature movement was actually dedicated to Baird. So my applying his lessons to the law as well is not accidental. But the one thing that lesson didn't teach me was how to be a novelist, and that's what I wanted to be. So I went back to Chicago, and pretty much out of frustration, I decided I had nothing else to do to learn to be a novelist. I was just going to have to write a novel. And that, in fact, is what I did. And the novel I wrote was called Dithyramb. Now, I would say that I probably didn't learn a lot as a freshman at Amherst College, but I did learn to be pretentious. And I don't really remember what dithyramb means. It's a Greek term. It's got something to do with a wild dance. I don't know exactly what. Why in the world I called the novel I was writing Dithyramb, I can't even begin to fetch an explanation. But Dithyramb was the story of two young men who had grown up, much as I had, on the north side of Chicago. And like Huck and Jim had followed the Mississippi, they'd run away from home, and in New Orleans they had witnessed the murder of an African-American prostitute and became involved in, the investigation of it and warring with the police. Now, when I talk about Dithyramb, I see certain things. I mean, one was an early fascination with crime, which I was many years before recognizing. And the other, of course, is, that the book was set in New Orleans. Now, I finished it over the summer, sent it out to publishers, all of whom sent it back because while the book was set in New Orleans, I had never been to New Orleans, and so it was lacking something in the way of atmosphere. So as these rejection slips are raining down on me, my three roommates began to torture me about the fact that Dithyramb was not getting a welcome reception in New York. And they confronted me with an issue of Time magazine, which said that Mickey Spillane was the best-selling author in the world. And there was this kind of a taunt, especially when I said to them, that stuff is just junk. I could write a novel like that in 3 weeks. And they kind of looked at me and said, oh yeah, what would you write in 3 weeks? And it turned out that I actually had an idea for a trashy novel in my head. I'd been very active in the civil rights movement, and I wanted to write, I thought what America needed, and this is before, Superfly and Shaft, I thought what America needed was a black superhero, somebody to lift up the image of African-American males. And my black superhero was going to be John Henry Steele, the Protector, the son of a Lena Horne-like figure and an industrial magnate, and he was not going into industry. He was going to become a protector, sort of a private secret service who also had sex every 25 pages. And my roommates listened to the description, especially the sex part, and they thought it sounded pretty good, and they made a proposal that they would go to class for me for the next 3 weeks and make notes for my papers and whatever else, and I would sit in the dorm room and pound out, John Henry Steele, the Protector. And they would then pay to have it professionally typed, and when we sent it to New York and riches came back, we would divide them 4 ways. Now, 2 of my roommates ended up as very successful corporate attorneys. The third is the chairman of Northwest Airlines, and I realize in retrospect that I was history's first victim of an LBO. But I didn't know it at the time. I wrote John Henry Steele, the Protector, sent it to New York, and history intervened, although I doubt history had much to do with it. But in the spring of my sophomore year in college, Dr. Martin Luther King was killed. And this, of course, began a racial cleavage in the United States that lasted for decades and made all the more preposterous the idea of a young white college student writing a novel about a black anything. And so this John Henry Steele, like Dithyramb, came back to us with regularity. I did write a cover letter explaining the creation of John Henry Steele, and most people ignored it, but there was an editor at Doubleday who said the novel, of course, under the circumstances was unpublishable, but the cover letter, on the other hand, might make the start on a promising book. I thought, however, that I was best off going back to more serious pursuits and began making a serious effort to write short stories. And by the time I was a senior, I, to my amazement, had begun to have short stories accepted for publication in little literary magazines which honesty compels me to admit were read principally by the people who hoped to publish in them and the parents of the people who had. But the Transatlantic Review started back in the 1920s by Ernest Hemingway, and Ford Madox Ford took a couple of my stories. One of them I read from this afternoon when I was talking to students, and I'm not going to repeat it here. It's a little bit racy. It's about an exhibitionist in a high school. It begins, it's called A Classic Case. Mrs. Dorothy Hamer, 52, thin-legged but sagging at the bosom and midriff, was one of the neighborhood ladies who enjoyed substitute teaching at Wilson High School once or twice a week. She said it kept her mind sharp, and of course she's eventually, in the first 2 pages, confronted by a young man who's exposed himself. Again, story reveals once more my unrecognized interest in crime. It was somewhat startling event at Amherst, especially to the members of the English department, since this was before the years of publish and perish. There were some very prominent, well-known critics and scholars in the Amherst English department, but not all of them. And so the fact that an undergraduate was publishing was at least noteworthy, and I was taking Professor Baird's Shakespeare class at that point. And he came up to me one day before class. I was already seated, and he loomed over me, and he rocked back and forth on his feet. And he said, "I read your short story last night. It wasn't bad. And you're such a harmless-looking little fellow." So with encouragement like that, I had to go on, and I did. I was lucky enough to win a writing fellowship to Stanford. And the Stanford writing program, started by Wallace Stegner, issued every year this sort of cardinal banded announcement of the Stanford writing fellowships. And a lot of the writers that I greatly admired, Tilly Olson, who eventually became my teacher, Robert Stone, Larry McMurtry, Ernest Gaines, all writers whose works I knew had been Stanford Writing Fellows. And so I aspired to be a Stanford Writing Fellow, and lo and behold, I became a Stanford Writing Fellow. And I arrived, of course, at an odd historical moment. It was 1970. The decade may have changed, but the ethos of the 60s still prevailed. Indeed, at Stanford during those years, there was literally gunfire across the quad as a Marxist group, Venceremos, sort of really wanted to topple the university. But it was in many ways, a really exciting environment. And many years later, when I wrote The Laws of Our Fathers, I tried to capture some of the feel of that time. Entering the town of Damon, California, everything gets changed, of course, in my fiction, but entering the town of Damon, California, which you'll recognize resembles much more Berkeley than Stanford, was much like crossing a national border. Beyond the campus environs dwelled men who looked as if they had gotten their haircuts in pencil sharpeners, and women in girdles. But here along Damon's main drag, Campus Boulevard, the culture of the young flourished in a tumbling, bizarre atmosphere. The town's transient elements, students and street freaks, hippies, home runaways, and communards, now far outnumbered the indigenous residents, the faculty families, and various grumpy Latinos who had watched as campus balls sprawled, surrounding the bookstores and student hangouts and mercados, with head shops, candle stores, and the new boutiques vending tie-dyed dresses and garments of macrame. The traffic thick at all hours, with touring gawkers staggered by, while street performers, mimics and bongo drummers and gentle pipers did their things, and the Damonites in leisure suits and floral granny gowns strolled the avenue among the soiled, barefoot hippies, each one inevitably accompanied by a mongrel dog leashed on a piece of string. On the building sides, the trisected peace sign was spray painted, while harsher words praised the NLF in Vietnam and Huey Newton, then in jail for supposedly killing a police officer. Appearing often amidst the graffiti and day-glow shades was a round-lettered injunction which simply urged, "Be free." Arriving, I found all of this, the commotion, the array, the slogans, inspiring. I could feel the life of my generation, historical, dynamic, epical, like a rush flowing through my arms. This was the bold new world, its shape as yet uncertain, but sure to be better than the one our parents had given us. So that was the way I approached life in the Bay Area. The years there, the 5 years I ended up spending at Stanford, were both good years and bad. I was surrounded by a number of young writers whose dedication to their craft sort of reinforced mine. Being in their company, I felt less embarrassed standing up and saying I wanted to be, and even was, a writer. On the other hand, it was a confused time, and certainly, as I have been frank to acknowledge, while not all the young writers at Stanford wrote like Ernest Hemingway, virtually all of them drank like Ernest Hemingway. So, there was a dissipated lifestyle there that probably was not good for somebody who was newly married. And the other thing that was not going too terribly well was my writing. I wrote a novel over those years called The Way Things Are. It was about a rent strike on the north side of Chicago. And the plot of The Way Things Are basically hinged on the implied warranty of habitability, which is a doctrine that says that a tenant has a right to live in a place which is actually fit for dwelling. And it may surprise you, but although the implied warranty of habitability fascinated me, it did not fascinate the dozens of publishers in New York who rejected that novel again. But it did begin to cause me to reflect. I'd been teaching at Stanford for 3 years, and I was beginning to face the fact that I'd sort of blundered into a career I didn't necessarily want to have. Academic life, which has been very good and a wonderful calling for many of my friends from Stanford in those years, was not for me. And so I began to think about what else I should be doing, since certainly The Way Things Are was not going to be supporting me. And I was struck by how much I had been engaged by the implied warranty of habitability. My friends, the new friends I had made in the Bay Area, besides the writers, were lawyers. My roommates from college, almost to a person, had gone off to law school. I was fascinated by what they were doing, and so the idea began to grow that I should go to law school. And of course, my life as a writer, my lifelong ambition, hung in the balance, but I figured that I should pursue my passion, even if it was something as surprising to me, as surprisingly establishmentarian as being a lawyer. And I would find somehow a way to write. And that's what I did. I applied to law school. I was accepted. I announced to my colleagues in the English department I was going to law school. Not all of them were happy with me. I remember one of them telling me that I was going to become the chainmail fist of the ruling class. But I went. And certainly for me, the most taxing part of that was to explain to my then literary agent that this is what I was doing. And I was very frightened of my literary agent because I couldn't understand a word she said, and I thought that was all my fault. Years later, I was able to recognize that it was still the days of the 3-martini lunch in New York. I was on the West Coast, as I've mentioned, leading a somewhat dissipated lifestyle of my own, so I was rarely up before 9 a.m., which meant I didn't reach her until after lunch, and she was, as far as I was concerned, incoherent. So I decided that I would have to write her a letter, and in the midst of writing this letter to my literary agent, it kind of dawned on me, I mean, how can I do this? This woman has, made these valiant efforts to try to sell the way things are. I've got to do something for her. And so, as I was about 2/3 of the way through the letter, I proposed that if she knew a young writer of nonfiction who happened to be going to law school, that it would be great if that person wrote a book about the daily experiences of law students, because I hadn't been able to find anything like that. I was not proposing that I write that book, because I, after all, was a novelist, I was an artiste, and I didn't think of myself as a writer of nonfiction, creative or otherwise. So I sent the letter off to New York. There was the stony silence I expected, and suddenly one day I go to my mailbox, and there's a contract to write a book. And what had happened is my then literary agent went out to lunch with a man named Ned Chase. And Ned had a very distinguished career in publishing, but he will, a little bit like Professor Baird, be best remembered to posterity for another reason. He is the father of Chevy Chase. And having over the years met both men, I can tell you that it's purely genetic. Ned is every bit as zany as his son was. He's now gone. And he and Elizabeth had had lunch. They'd had their 3 martinis. It started to rain, so they had a bottle of wine. It kept raining, so they had a second bottle of wine. At about 5 o'clock, Ned and Elizabeth had agreed there was not a good idea for a book anywhere in the city of New York, at which point she remembered she had my letter in her purse. And they were both too smashed to realize I was not proposing to write this book. But as you can tell from my stories, I could paper my walls in rejection slips. And so I had this contract, I signed it, and went off to Harvard Law School and make new friends about them. In the next year, I kept a journal. And in the summer, after my first year in law school, which was a very intense year for me for many reasons, I finished the manuscript of 1L. And 1L sort of capsulized by the opening passage. It is Monday morning, and when I walk into the central building, I can feel my stomach clench. For the next 5 days, I will assume that I am somewhat less intelligent than anyone around me. At most moments, I'll suspect that the privilege I enjoy was conferred as some kind of peculiar hoax. I will be certain that no matter what I do, I will not do it well enough, and when I fail, I know that I will burn with shame. By Friday, my nerves will be so brittle from sleeplessness and pressure and intellectual fatigue that I will not be certain I can make it through the day. After years off, I have begun to smoke cigarettes again. Lately, I seem to be drinking a little every night. I do not have the time to read a novel or a magazine, and I am so far removed from the news of world events that I often feel as if I've fallen off the dark side of the planet. I am distracted at most times and have difficulty keeping up a conversation, even with my wife. At random instants, I am likely to be stricken with acute feelings of panic, depression, indefinite need, and the pep talks and irony I practice on myself only seem to make it worse. I am a law student in my first year at the law, and there are many moments when I am simply a mess. Now, so that's what I sent to Ned, and of course the drunken provenance of the book came back to bite me in the behind, to be honest. The phone rings, and it's Ned, and he hasn't, he's just read the manuscript. I've been waiting weeks for his reaction, and he says, I want you to remind me of just one thing. And I said, you don't like the way the book is written. He had told me to read Intern by Dr. X and The Gospel According to Harvard Business School. He said, no, the writing is fine. You don't like the way it's typed, I said, because I had a broken eye on my typewriter, and it struck between the lines in the double space. No, he says, we can read the darn thing. No, he says, I need you, just remind me, why did I ever want to buy this book? And he meant it. And although I'm sometimes called the father of the legal thriller, the truth of the matter is that any claim I can ever have made to sort of forecasting the booming American interest in the law came when I was selling 1L back to Ned, and that was all sales talk. It was just palaver. But he did publish it, although his reluctance goes to explain what people sometimes take as one of the great mysteries about 1L, which is namely, why would I publish the book while I was still a student at Harvard Law School? And the answer was because I was afraid if I waited, my publisher wouldn't publish it at all. But that had inevitable consequences. Since 1L is a work of nonfiction, people recognized who they were, even though I changed names to protect the guilty. And people had, varying reactions to 1L. People who thought they were favorably portrayed regarded it as a discerning literary work. People who did not think they were as well portrayed had other opinions. And chief among the people with other opinions was the professor who thought that he was the model for the heavy of 1L, a character whom I called Professor Rudolph Perini. Professor Perini was portrayed as a sort of brutal utilizer of the Socratic method of classroom interrogation. And I knew this professor was angry, but just how angry he was, I didn't realize until the end of what was my first semester in my third year in law school, when one of my friends came running with the test book from this particular professor's copyright class. And the last question on that exam went something like this. You are an associate in a large law firm. A senior partner has introduced you to his valued client, Professor Rudolph Perini. Professor Perini has undergone the humiliating experience of having a student, Ray Ripoff, write a book about his daily classroom lectures. Please list all theories under which Professor Perini can sue Ray Ripoff. So This convinced me that my life was not in nonfiction. I became an assistant U.S. attorney in Chicago and began writing on the morning commuter train. It was the only time I had to sort of keep this dream alive of being a novelist. And I learned a lot about being a novelist as an assistant U.S. attorney in trying cases. I learned to ask myself what the purposes of the novel were. I learned how to address a popular audience in trying a case. And of course, I finally recognized how deeply stimulated I was, both personally and as a writer, by crime. And I'd started a number of different things, but after about 2 or 3 years as an AUSA, I began a book drawn very loosely from experiences I had had while working as a clerk in the DA's office in Boston. And that book was Presumed Innocent. I wrote faithfully every morning for the 25 minutes or so that I had. I found that the intense experience of being a prosecutor, although the story, of course, was nothing about what I as a federal prosecutor was experiencing, the intensity of my life as a prosecutor, my own upheaval about what was right and what was wrong and how the law functioned, managed to come into the book. When I was 16 years old, I had read an essay in The Atlantic by a Boston lawyer, ironically named, I think it's Alan Trachtenberg, and he had written the screenplay for Bullitt. And he said Bullitt, which began the car chase in American movies, and he wrote, "Bullitt changed my life." Well, Presumed Innocent changed my life. And this is how the novel starts. It was a passage that I wrote holed up in a resort in northern Wisconsin. My now former wife had insisted on taking our son, who was about 18 months old, with us. So this was supposed to be our getaway. And my son behaved exactly the way he always behaved when we took him someplace new, which was incorrigibly badly. So my ex wasn't speaking to me, and I wasn't speaking to her, and I just began writing on the hotel pad, totally drawn back to my novel. This is how I always start. I am the prosecutor. I represent the state. I am here to present to you the evidence of a crime. Together, you will weigh this evidence. You will deliberate upon it. You will decide if it proves the defendant's guilt. This man, and here I point. You must always point, Rusty, I was told by John White. That was the day I started in the office. The sheriff took my fingerprints, the chief judge swore me in, and John White brought me up to watch the first jury trial I'd ever seen. Ned Halsey was making the opening statement for the state, and as he gestured across the courtroom, John, in his generous avuncular way with the humid scent of alcohol on his breath, at 10 in the morning whispered my initial lesson. He was the chief deputy PA then, a hale Irishman with white hair wild as corn silk. It was almost a dozen years ago, long before I had formed even the most secret ambition to hold John's job myself. If you don't have the courage to point, John White whispered, you can't expect them to have the courage to convict. And so I point. I extend my hand across the courtroom. I hold one finger straight. I seek the defendant's eye. I say, this man has been accused. He turns away, or blinks, or shows nothing at all. In the beginning, I was often preoccupied, imagining how it would feel to sit there, held at the focus of scrutiny, ardently denounced before all who cared to listen, knowing that the most ordinary privileges of a decent life, common trust, personal respect, and even liberty were now like some cloak you had checked at the door and might never retrieve. I could feel the fear, the hot frustration, the haunted separateness. Now, like ore deposits, the harder stuff of duty and obligation has settled in the veins where those softer feelings moved. I have a job to do. It is not that I have grown uncaring, believe me. But this business of accusing, judging, punishing has gone on always. It is one of the great wheels turning beneath everything we do. I play my part. I am a functionary of our only universally recognized system of telling right from wrong, a bureaucrat of good and evil. This must be prohibited, not that. One would expect that after all these years of making charges, trying cases, watching defendants come and go, it might have all become a jumble. Somehow, it has not. As I said, Presumed Innocent changed my life in many ways. Not only the success of the novel, but the fact that I knew how fascinated I was with crime. I had been blessed to discover, to dare to go into an area that had seemed to be such a strange U-turn, and yet crime continues to fascinate me. It is truly one of the great playing fields of the human imagination. It's in many ways, it deserves to be admired from the distance if people weren't getting hurt all the time in the same way as art. Because if you want to talk about thinking outside the box, you should hear some of the stuff I've heard in my office. And the law will probably always inform what I write. And I don't generally steal from life, but it's much more the milieu of the law. But I'm going to close by reading one more passage, and then I'm going to take your questions. But I frankly couldn't resist, given the nature of the institution. This is from The Burden of Proof. Remo Cavarelli was a thief. He stole as a profession with attitudes not unlike a professional hunter's. He admired what he stole. He enjoyed taking it. He looked forward to doing it again. And he regarded apprehension as part of his calling. Each time he went to jail, and he had done 3 stretches already, he lamented the effect on his family. On the last occasion, Sandy Stern, Remo's lawyer, remembered Remo had wept wildly as he contemplated separation from his young son, but he had come of age among men who made bluff pronouncements about the time they had done, and so when he was caught, Remo Cavarelli pled guilty. So Stern takes Remo into court and into the courtroom, and he then comes back out and tries one more time to convince Remo that he shouldn't plead guilty. And Remo, because it's a light case, and Remo says the following: "This here thing," Remo said, "is Friday time. You know what I mean?" Stern did not. He shook his head. "What's your religion?" asked Remo. "Catholic, right?" Stern is Latin but Jewish. Stern shook his head once more. With his Latin accent, he had long found that Remo's mistake was often made. After all these years, he was certain that it would shock poor Remo to learn the truth. But Remo made no further inquiry. He was caught up with what he was saying. "See, in the Roman Catholic religion, for all the time I was growing up, the priests say, no meat on Friday. Don't eat meat on Friday. You know, fish, that's okay. Jello mold, that's okay, but no meat. See? But guys done it, lots of guys. Sometimes you'd slip up or something, you know. You'd be eating a steak, then you'd think like, Jesus, what day is this? Sometimes it'd be on purpose. I remember when I was at St. Viator's, there's a group of us, we'd go for burgers just on Fridays. We'd sit in a booth in the window and wave to the sisters when they went walking by. I'm not kidding. Remo laughed to himself and wobbled his large, dark face. Oh, we was bad. Then, all of a sudden, the priests changed their minds. See, it's okay now. Have whatever you like, no problem. But what happened to all the guys who's down burning in hell for eating meat on Fridays, huh? You think they let them out? I asked the father, you know, because I'm wondering. I asked, those guys get out or what? Oh, no, he says, God's rules is God's rules. You don't screw with them. You know, I mean, he don't say you don't screw with them, but you get what I'm saying. So this here thing, it's Friday time. It's BS. I didn't do nothing. Honest to God, I crossed my heart. It wasn't my job, you know. I heard about this thing, so I shown up and all. I figured could be I'd get a piece. But maybe these guys and I, maybe we done some things before. See? So that's how it works out. It's Friday time on account of what we done before. So what can you do? Remo shifted his large shoulders and raised his hands. He did not control God's universe. He merely understood a few of its rules. Thank you all. Questions?
So Mr. Turow has agreed to take some questions. So if you just raise your hand, we'll bring the mic to you so you can ask your questions. So just for a few minutes.
I always say I'll take questions on any subject. You know, you want to talk about the Cubs and their dismal prospects for yet another season. I'll be happy to talk about the Cubs, movies.
This may seem very trivial, but where do you come up with the ideas of their names?
Oh.
You know, I mean, there are so many characters, and you are so colorful in this. I mean, your mind must be filled with all kinds of different names, for example.
Well, I have to admit I'm a great admirer of names. And, of course, one of the great things about, you know, watching baseball, for example, is, you know, where do these guys get these names? They're such great names. And, of course, if you can name a character relatively colorfully, then it makes it easier for a reader to remember. Remo Cavarelli disappears for a good 250 pages before he comes back into the burden of proof when Sandy, of course, needs something stolen. And so Remo comes to the rescue and steals it. But so, you know, I try not to name characters with the same first letter as another character, because I think it can, generally speaking, get confusing. But, you know, the names generally just come to me. And, you know, obviously, I don't know where I ran across somebody named Remo, but I heard that and I hung on to it, because I thought, you know, well, you know, that's perfect. But I admit I do spend some time thinking about, you know, what to call, you know, characters. And I'm in the midst of a novel, and it's getting to the point where it has to be fixed, because I'm going to show it to my publishers, and I am struggling to make sure that the names are really right. So you're right, Tony, to perceive that some effort goes into this.
Scott, one of your fans would like to know if you're planning another novel with the character Sandy Stern.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to repeat that. I wasn't...
One of your fans in the audience would like to know if you're going to be writing another novel with the character Sandy Stern.
Oh, well, Sandy Stern is critically ill at the end of Innocent, and the last novel I published. And I have to admit, Stern, who has appeared in, I think, every novel, albeit most of the time in a cameo, a part of me was ready to let him go, but I don't think so. So he's, I hope, headed for an extraordinary recovery.
Could you tell us some of the contemporary writers that you particularly admire or whom you read in your leisure time?
I tend to read serious contemporary fiction. And I think, frankly, we are blessed right now that there are so many great novelists writing. I think among people writing in English, my greatest admiration is for Cormac McCarthy and Ian McEwan, who I think are, both miraculous writers. When I was younger, I was completely enthralled with Saul Bellow, my fellow Chicagoan, who for some reason I did not recognize until after both men had died, had gone to high school with my father. And, I mentioned Tilly Olson, who was a huge influence on me, and Graham Greene. What have I read recently? I read The Tiger's Wife by Tia Obrecht. I thought that was really very good. I'm now reading Nicole Krauss's The History of Love, just because I missed it. I read other writers with my mouth hanging open, but also with a lot of the pure pleasure that I read when I was 11 years old and first was captured by the Count of Monte Cristo. So a great book is a gift, unlike anything else.
You're the product of an elite education. Can you make and they're under fire right now, can you make a case for the opportunities you've had?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand, and I think my hearing is poor, but if I can be honest, you were speaking really quickly.
Okay. You're the product of an elite education, and educations like yours have been under fire recently. Can you make a case for the kind of opportunities you've had?
Well, you're right. My mom looked at me as we were crossing the Harvard campus, and I'd been to Amherst, then I'd been to Stanford, and then I was at Harvard, and she looked at me and she said, you've had the education of a prince. And she was right. And for the grandson of a milkman, that was pretty astonishing. You're right that elite educations are under a great deal of scrutiny now, particularly because the tuition continues to skyrocket. And yet, people are competing fiercely to get into those institutions. And, at Amherst, I've been on the board for 10 years. And several years ago, probably in my first or second year on the Amherst board, we did not have the yield that we had hoped for among African American acceptees. And so the board began drilling into this. And we were presented with all kinds of statistics. And when the session was over, I said to the dean of students, I said, Tom, I must be missing something, because this document seems to indicate that half the African Americans who applied to Amherst College, where the tuition was around $50,000 a year at that time, half of them weren't seeking financial aid. I said, how is that possible? And he says, it doesn't really mean anything, that half of the applicants are all the children of our graduates. And I looked at him and I said, that means everything. That's the whole point. There is nothing in our society like an elite education to transform, poor, working class kids into members of the national elite. The kids that I had gone to school with, the African American kids, and there weren't that many of them, had become, in a single generation, people who had $50,000 a year in disposable income to send their children to a place like Amherst. On the board, recognizing that the unique capacity of elite institutions to transform the lives of the people who go there, we've spent a lot of time in the last decade trying to make that experience more democratically available. And that is not to say to find unqualified students, but to concentrate on making sure that there's more economic diversity at Amherst. And we've succeeded. 20 to 25% of a class at Amherst these days comes from families who are Pell Grant eligible. The educators, the many educators here know what that means. That means these are families who make less than $40,000 a year. I would say that the one real problem that I see remaining, and it has to do with aid formulas more than anything else, is that access to that elite education is still, ironically, much higher for kids who are truly from middle-class families. You know, mom is a nurse and dad is a truck driver or a bus driver. And, you know, that's a family where the family income probably exceeds $100,000 a year, which sounds like a lot of money until you have to start paying $50,000 after tax, and then it becomes impossible. And the aid formulas don't do enough yet. Well more than half the class at Amherst receives financial aid, and that's a good thing. But we do have more to do, particularly in opening the doors wider to people from, you know, middle-class, working-class backgrounds. The reality, of course, is of the 8,200 kids who apply every year to be one of the 450 who are entering a place like Amherst, half of them could come there, do the work, and prosper. You know, it's roulette, and it's roulette of enormous consequence. And should there be 10 times more schools that can do what Amherst can do? Of course. And the reality, of course, is that we're doing a pretty good job of that. American higher education delivers a better and better product. You know, people who go to college in this country do far better than people who don't. But there is no doubt that the reality is that there's probably 50 institutions in this country that if you get in, you've basically been admitted to the economic top tier in the country, if that's the direction you choose to go. And it's an interesting problem. So.
Thank you.
Prosecutor, I of course saw the world from the other side. There was no federal death penalty during those years. And yet I understood what prosecutors were doing. One of my best friends in the office was deputized as a special prosecutor in a death penalty case. And when he went, by the time I'd been an assistant for 8 years, I felt that whatever my views were about the death penalty, I too, if I had been asked to carry out that assignment, would have been able to do that, that was the judgment of my community, that these kinds of crimes should be punished in that way. And I have enough respect for the law that whatever I thought, I would be able to do the job. Then, of course, I became a defense lawyer. And I had a lot of experiences as a defense lawyer, especially in pro bono work, that began to make me see this differently. Certainly the most profound experience I had was representing a young man named Alex Hernandez, who had been tried twice, sentenced to death once, then sentenced to 80 years for a crime, the murder of a 10-year-old girl, which was immediately apparent to me he had not, it was a crime he hadn't committed. And an incensed community, hungry for justice, had wanted to be believed, especially in the early 1980s, that these Latino outsiders had committed this crime, which had disturbed the peace of their community. The irony was that the man who had confessed to the crime a few years later was white, didn't come from very far away. And that began to become a window for me into the fallacies of the criminal justice system. Where I was hung up was John Wayne Gacy was executed while I was working on Alex's case. John Wayne Gacy remains one of the great mass murderers in American history. He had killed 33 young men. And I was asked to speak out about the Gacy execution. And so I went and studied the case. And there were admittedly disturbing things. Gacy was crazy, suffered from multiple personality disorder, but he'd been deemed to be sane in the narrow meanings of the law, meaning he knew right from wrong. And 2 or 3 of the personalities clearly did. And when I contemplated the crimes, which were bestial beyond imagining, he literally tortured these young men to death. And then I thought about the 33 families who had lost children and never knew what happened to them. Parents who went through their whole lives hoping and wondering if their son might still be alive somewhere. I felt I could not speak out against Gacy's execution. Whether I would have pushed the button, as Sister Helen Prejean talks about, was a different issue. And what I eventually came to was realizing that the measure of the death penalty is not whether there are horrible cases that so rile our spirits that the urge for revenge of some kind is strong. That is not the way we ought to think about the death penalty. I don't take a religious position on it, although I would bet that a lot of people in this room do, and I respect those views. But to me, that's not the way you answer questions in a democracy. So much as I respect the spiritual views of people, to me the question is, how does the system function? And does the system give us what we think we want from capital punishment? And what Americans think they want, I believe, is a sense of moral proportion, a belief that for ultimate evil there is an ultimate punishment. And if you look at the way, in an objective, conscientious way, if you look at the way the system works, you do not get that. You do not get moral proportion. You get a complete lottery in which issues of race and class, of course, play a large role. Who the prosecutor is, who the defense lawyer is, where the crime is committed, the gender of the gender of the offender, and the race of the victim. We execute 3 times more people in this country for killing white people than killing black people. And whether the county can afford to mount a capital prosecution. Have there been a couple of others in the same year? Well, the third person is much less likely to be prosecuted capitally. And when you stand back and look at it, the answer to the question is emphatically no. We are not getting what Americans think they want in having capital punishment. There is no moral proportion being produced by this system. And although, as I said to start, I really respect the depth of people's views on this subject, I think for me it was clear that the death penalty did not work. That it was going to be abolished in Illinois is something that I never would have predicted when I finished my service in 2002 on the Capital Punishment Commission in Illinois, that within a decade the death penalty was going to be abolished in Illinois. I wouldn't have believed it if you told me that. And yet it has been. It is clearly the right thing to do. And there are more and more states that are recognizing it. And if asked for a prediction, I would predict that I used to say by the end of the century, I'm beginning to believe by the middle of this century, the death penalty will have been abolished in the United States. So.
Sir, if we're looking at our next generation and they say, what's a book? What I'd like to know for you and for budding authors is what's the impact of Kindle and iPads in terms of getting started or getting published or getting recognized? Does it have an impact, positive or negative, and where is that leading us?
As I think everybody has probably noticed, publishing is a business in turmoil. Reading has declined steadily in the United States, especially since 9/11. Media like the internet, cable TV, streaming compete for people's attention. So the audience is slowly shrinking. And the business of publishing is being roiled, in particular, by Amazon, which really seems like it would, as an ultimate goal, like to sell and now publish every book that's going to see the light of day in the United States. And I give Jeff Bezos a lot of credit for all kinds of innovative marketing. I am not an admirer of some of the business tactics that Amazon has employed. But there is going to be literature. It may not be the same numbers as a generation ago, but there are a lot of people, educated and not, who take pleasure in reading. Literature isn't going to die. Is it going to be consumed more often on devices like this? Unquestionably. There are plenty of people in this room who say, I love physical books, I want to touch the paper, I want to turn the pages, but try telling your kids that and see how many of them feel that way. So electronic digital reading is probably here to stay, and it's only going to grow. There are lots of business reasons why that's the case too. It reduces the cost of books. So that's going to happen, but I don't think that's a threat. The loss of bookstores is a threat. It is a threat not to people like me. My books sell more online and sell more in e-books than they do as physical books, because those markets favor established authors. The place where people become acquainted with new authors, people whose names they may have heard in a review or not even at all. The place where that happens most often is in a bookstore, where you pick up a book and turn a page and go, wow, this seems neat. I'm going to take this too. And so the fact that bookstores are dying in the United States is a grave problem for people who are coming, who want to be writers, because it's going to be harder and harder for them to be introduced. Are there means, social media, tweeting, whatever it is, weird kinds of word of mouth on the social media? Yeah, but a lot of that puts a premium on self-promotion, which, writing is an introverted profession, and yet it's increasingly one that favors people who've got extrovert skills. And I am a fan of publishers, not all of them. There are plenty of practices. I'm president of the Authors Guild. We're fighting like mad with the major publishers because they've figured out in an era of declining profits that they're going to increase them by paying authors less. And I have no need to support some behemoth corporation's bottom line. I think that's wrong. But publishers are the venture capitalists of the literary world. And, we have a class of professional writers today because publishers pay them advances, and they're able to support themselves between books. If that disappears, then it's, again, going to be one more winner-take-all phenomenon. People like me whose books sell well, yes, of course I can bankroll myself between books. I don't even sign a contract between books. But, for people further down the food chain, that's not clear. And so we'll probably have many fewer professional writers if publishing disappears, or publishing, as it appears to be the case, it becomes much less profitable. And that's tragic. And in many cases, we will be back to the model of patronage. And, our universities now are probably the leading patrons of the arts. And that's fine. And God bless the universities for doing that. But writers are freest when they can create without regard to whether the dean's going to be ticked off or not. It's a troubled profession. I mean, that's the short answer. There are going to be books, but it's going to be much harder for younger people to make their way as writers. And that, I think, is pretty clearly the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Turow. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the Contemporary Writers Series. And now I'd like to call Mr. Ryan Bossy back to the stage to offer our benediction.
This last poem was suggested heavily by several people. It's by a poet who is from the past poet of the program, and somebody I know who is very important to Linda Nemec Foster, Liesl Mueller. And this poem is Why We Tell Stories, and it is for Linda Nemec Foster. Because we used to have leaves, and on damp days our muscles feel a tug, painful now, from when roots pulled us into the ground. And because our children believe they can fly, an instinct retained from when the bones in our arms were shaped like zithers and broke neatly under their feathers. And because before we had lungs, We knew how far it was to the bottom as we floated open-eyed, like painted scarves through the scenery of dreams, and because we awakened and learned to speak. We sat by the fire in our caves, and because we were poor, we made up a tale about a treasure mountain that would open only for us. And because we were always defeated, we invented impossible riddles only we could solve, monsters only we could kill, women who could love no one else. And because we had survived sisters and brothers, daughters and sons, we discovered bones that rose from the dark earth and sang as white birds in the trees. Because the story of our life becomes our life, because each of us tells the same story, but tells it differently. And none of us tells it the same way twice. Because grandmothers looking like spiders want to enchant the children, and grandfathers need to convince us what happened because of them. And though we listen only haphazardly, with one ear, we will begin our story with the word "and."
And just a couple of little things before we close. I think we made a comment before that if you would like to be added to the mailing list for the Contemporary Writers Series, we'll have some cards in the back of the room, and you can fill out the card and give it to any member of the Aquinas staff, and we'd be very happy to receive that from you to keep you up to date on our future calendar. And I think we're going to have a very exciting calendar of writers next year. So thank you all once again, and on behalf of President Olivares and the Contemporary Writers Series, thanks for coming out tonight, and we wish you a safe journey home, and be free. And thank you again, Scott, for a wonderful presentation.